How's it, guys? Monday night, another weekend gone. Weekend's been about 3 weeks long, so enough of the weekend now. We always tend to, it would be nice to know what people that have a day job feel like on the weekends when they can just stay at home. I don't know who asked that question, but stop it. So tonight, as we said, we're going to talk about some broadcast stuff, specifically in the live environment, or live broadcasting environment. And then just have a look at it from different perspectives. Got a couple of things to talk about. Obviously, one of the main reasons SoundGP exists is because of our specialty or our niche being in DVD recording / broadcast audio that we've been doing for just over 10 years now. Our company's grown. We've got our infrastructure has gone up. We've got crew. We've got skilled crew. But it's still our main focus. I mean, we've not bought PA. We've not invested in any kind of large format environment that will allow us to turnkey do big productions. Although we do big productions, we partner with some great companies. But our focus and our niche has stayed within what we want to do and what we're good at doing. But the guys have obviously developed a broad-based skill set. So on the live broadcast perspective, what makes it a little bit different is being a live broadcast, obviously there's no pause button. A lot of guys, I've seen guys take different approaches over the years. Some guys take simple stuff. I mean, some broadcasts I'll go as far as a left, right, off the front of house. If it's just purely a conference type thing with the speaking mic is key, then you can get away with taking that as a source, but you need some way of manipulating. If you're just taking it as a source of front of house, chances are 85 to 90% of the time the level is going to be two things: inconsistent and probably too soft. Obviously, the normalization that's applied in the venue is for the venue. I mean, the amount of perceived volume that goes into a room when someone's sitting at a podium or speaking at a podium and the room's quiet, everybody's listening. And you think it's loud, but it's not that loud because it's a spoken word. Plates rattling and waiters making a noise distracts everybody, and we've all seen that because the noise is not overpowering, or the volume. And if someone was much louder than that, same level as what music was, it would be unnatural. I mean, we've gotten used to the way that we perceive sound in a live environment. Even to the point where we're going to noisy environments, we adapt the way that we anchor ourselves in terms of what we hear. So if you're in a quiet environment, you quieten down. If you're in a noisy environment, you go noisy or you go louder. If you spent 2 hours in a noisy environment, you come away the next morning, your throat is sore. You didn't realize you were screaming. So our lives are full of volume changes or perceived volume changes, which we know as how loud something is. And the word loud, into the broadcast environment, we're talking about loudness. And loudness is just how loud something is, and we're talking about dynamic range. Dynamics being what's the difference between the loudest and the softest elements of a particular source, so that you can average that out and get a perceived volume. I've got a couple of clips I'll show you, or not clips, just some sayings and stuff while I'm talking. But it is something that we get used to. So if you translate that to someone sitting at home in a private environment, you've been watching your favorite soapy, you've been listening to music the whole day, you've been working, you've sort of set your environment to what your comfort level is. So, if you've been watching a soapy and the next thing that comes on is a live broadcast, you don't necessarily sit there with the volume in your hand anticipating to want to change it. If you're a regular viewer of some unnamed video TV channels, you probably have the remote glued in your hand because when the ad breaks come on, your windows explode. When they go back to the movie or something, you can't hear anything because they don't have proper what we call automatic loudness control on the broadcast side. But that's a different story. Most of our broadcasters do a very good job at making sure that their prime channels have got good dynamic and loudness across the board. But having said that, coming into an environment where we now come from a remote site, where we compile a mix and we send it to a broadcast, the approach to that mix needs to be in context with what you're hearing from the source, obviously. And when I say source, I'm talking about the material on the show, as well as all the bits in between. Now the bits in between are your logos, your EVS playbacks, your ads, all the different elements. And when you look at a program on a TV program, the whole thing is considered. So the ad breaks that are in between are part of what the people are exposed to, what the people are watching, because you don't want to be, if there's a very popular TV ad coming just after a prime slot, if someone's paying for that TV slot and that ad is not in your face, which is what they want, they complain to the broadcaster. So they make the guys who do the post for that. And just on a side note, I'm going to talk about it a bit more, but we're going to talk to Tina Smith on Wednesday night. Tina Smith is from SFX Audio Post. He's on the SACIA board for the big council, Broadcast Council, and he's going to share with us a little bit more on the technical side and what actually happens to a signal between someone like me who's doing the music mix and the broadcast mix and the consumer at home, and all the technical specs in between. And then from my perspective, my responsibility to know what that entire process is so that I can contextualize what I'm doing into that format. Obviously, you can't listen off air when you're mixing live because of the delay. It'll freak your brain out, because what's happening live now here is a couple of seconds later with the consumer. So you can reference it, but you can't stay on it. I often reference it in odd moments, or when I'm not, in different scenarios. Especially pre-show, I often go and I'll ask for the broadcast van that's next to my OB van, my music van. I'll ask them for an off-air feed of the channel that we're going to be broadcast on. That's very important. Not the soccer that's playing or something like that, the actual channel. And I'll run that back into my console on an unrouted channel somewhere, and I'll stick a loudness meter on that I can visualize, and I'll run it for at least an hour so that I can see what the loudness specifications or what the outcome is of that channel over an hour, because I need to fill into that. I need to make sure that when I come in, I'm pronouncing at the same emphasis as the program that I'm coming out of, and also my program mustn't come overbearing. I mustn't be too soft. So it'll be something that I need to consider. But let's we're going to talk a lot about that technical stuff on Wednesday. So tune in for that one. That's going to be cool, having a guest and not just sitting and talking to myself. But please send your questions if there are any. I've got a couple of things here, something that I've just spoken about, and it's become a big talking point over the last couple of years. If you talk about loudness and our loudness leveling encourage mixing only by ear after setting levels and fixed monitor volume. That's a very key point. And if you've ever listened to me speak about any kind of mixing environment or anything like that, even my staff and the guys who work with me, your monitoring volume is so important. I remember, I think Paul's actually watching this. He might be watching this if I have a look here. I just realized my laptop's making a lot of noise here next to me, so I'm just quitting some apps. Paul Smith, he's a freelance audio guarantee now. Worked with him for many years. I remember one of the first times we worked with him, I was sitting on a Lawu console. We were prepping for, I think it was a Samas. I don't think it was a Samas. It might have been something else, because I was actually in the OB, in the SABC OB, mixing on the Lawu. We had a band on the left side of the console. We had all the stems and effects and anchors on the right hand side of the console. I was running some VCAs, and we're just doing setups and sound checks and all that. And eventually he asked me, are you running loudness somewhere? I'm like, what do you mean? And I didn't at this point know all the intricacies. I'm just quite a few years back. And he tapped on the screen that displays the integrated loudness. And I was sitting on neg 23. And this is just after about 3-4 hours of rehearsals and tech and all that. And I was actually averaging out exactly where I was supposed to be. But I'm working on my ear, which means I was running at the volume that I want to be. Annoyingly to him, because I was running a little bit louder than what most broadcast guys do, because they got grams and radios and comms and other guys stuff to worry about. So they often run their monitoring a little bit softer, and they do mix on visuals a lot. And sports guys can do that and get away with it. But when you're doing music, you've got to listen. So I'm often running at about, I run in about 87 dB SPL on average at my mixing position, which is a little bit louder than what you would run in your normal studio, about 3 dBs, because of the fact that I have got a director and a comms panel going, and a little bit of hustle and bustle. Even when I'm in my own OB, generally what I do is I place what we call the shout mic, which is the director calling the show, on a different speaker out of my sound field in front of me. I normally put it to the side down so that I can hear where it comes from. The reason I put it down is when someone walks up and talks behind me, they're on ear level, so I can identify who's talking to me. And then I run that so that I can hear that all the time. And it's a mental thing. You get used to hearing it, and you pick up on key elements. I actually run the production assistant louder than the director because they do all the counting. So I've got a very set level that I want to run my monitoring at. And that all brings me to a point where, and I don't touch my monitoring. I've got a monitoring control. I've got a dim button that I press in and out. I don't adjust the volume. And if you speak to one of my guys, I'll take them on if they start fiddling with the volume. Don't adjust your volume. You've got to be working at a fixed volume because your ears, muscle memory kicks in. You get used to hearing what you're hearing. And when you start mixing, you're mixing to that volume. And you can start, and it'll start showing in your outcome. So that's very important. I do that by running some virtual sound checks. I run some music that I know something is that I like. I set up the room, tune the room quite nicely as much as I can. I listen to reference music, get a feel for it, check what my levels are, do some loudest measurements, and I'm like, okay, I'm happy now. And then I make sure that I'm going to be comfortable. And then that's when that level is what I work my mix at. Now, obviously, at that volume, if you take a TV program where they say 12 songs, program's 2 hours long, songs are generally about 2.5 minutes each. I've got quite a few times between songs where I don't have to be at that volume, where I will press the dim button and rest my ears, because that's also another thing. And you sit there for 2 hours at that volume, your ears will start clamping down. So it's just managing your ears, managing what you're doing, staying in context. But this, what's on the screen here, encourages only by ear at a fixed monitor level. That's the key part. And then Neg 23 LUFS is the new center of the audio leveling universe. And I think that was just a nice way. All these clips that I'm putting up here, I got out of a PDF, which if you want it, just mail us at TalkGP, and we'll share this with you. It's a very good, proper document on what is loudness, how it works, how to set it up, what's all the different elements and all that kind of stuff. But if you're in the broadcast environment these days, around the broadcast centers everywhere, everybody's talking Neg 23, Neg 23, Neg 23, and it's something that we've got to be aware of, because that is what we're being measured at. And the Neg 23 basically refers to an integrated loudness over a period of time. So if your program is 2 hours long or an hour long, over that period of an hour, you have to average out Neg 23 with a little bit of a tolerance, which we'll get to. And then obviously live content, they are a little bit lenient on tolerances because and make exceptions. And you've got to talk to the broadcasters. You've got to have a relationship with engineers, but you've got to do everything within your power to respect that, because I said it the other night, trying to work within these loudness tolerances is like taking a cardboard tube with a hose pipe that's about 1 meter long and trying to get the water through there without touching the sides, because if you touch the sides, the cardboard's just going to get mushy and then the whole thing collapses. So it's not that easy, but it is achievable. If you get the water pressure right and you've got the right fitting on the hose pipe, you can actually do it. Sorry, enough about the hose pipe. But just being aware of it, understanding what it is, what the role is, what you're doing, brings you then to the mixing element. Within your mix, I've said it a couple of times over the last couple of days, being responsive instead of reactive. So your workflow within your console, if you're sitting on a digital console these days, you can set up your layers and you can get to a point where right in front of you in an easy to reach area is everything you need for now and what the context is. If you can run snapshots, those will go according to the scenes of the script, and you can have always what you need. You don't want to go flipping through layers and trying to find stuff. It's got to be on your fingers immediately, and you can only get that with rehearsal and planning and working your workflows properly. Obviously, if I'm doing a broadcast where there's 80 odd channels from a band perspective only, I've got to do a lot of preparation to get that element within a responsive control instead of a reactive control. I mean, I can't go find a tom or go find a guitar or something quick enough for the viewer not to hear it. If I'm doing the mix, and we've all been in this situation, that you hear something quicker than everybody else because you're focused on what you're doing, you've heard it a couple of times, and if you can respond within that first little bit, you can save it. So people will hear it, but I mean, you're not making an obvious mistake or an oversight. If you're not following the cameras, for example, and there's a guitar solo and you're busy sitting over here trying to get your keyboard sound sorted out, you look up and it's on guitar and you go, ooh, guitar. You push up the guitar, and people at home going, for the first 10 seconds, they can't hear the guitar. You're not even looking at it. So obviously that kind of thing comes in. I've got a screen in front of me always with as many cameras as possible. Obviously the preview camera, which I can see where the director is planning to go, the actual on-air camera. I take a wide shot, which is generally next to the stage, a jib or a rear of the room wide shot, so I can see context on stage where people are for some spacing stuff, and just so that I can keep in touch with the room as much as possible. But it's important to stay in that context because you can so easily get stuck in your own world. On the desk, being in control of your mix also means, what you can do is you can easily take your mix as you would normally mix, go over the master output, whether you do it via matrix or whatever you're going to be sending out, put loudness control there via compression. Loudness control basically just means controlling your dynamic range. So your peaks, bring your peaks down, bring your low levels up, and then you can get to an average. But if you do that at the end, obviously it changes the whole thing. I mean, how many of you have done a mix where, if you're on a DAW system, a DAW, and you like, oh, I'm clipping out, you put a compressor in, and your whole mix texture changes. You've got to go readjust some of the stuff you've done in your rhythm section and all that. That's why mastering in itself is a massive skill. There's nothing worse than being given something to master that's already being compressed on the output bus. Because that compression's also changed. So I'm not saying don't do it. Obviously, if you work well, if you're a mix engineer working well with a mastering engineer, and you guys have got a good relationship going, you can do certain things. But if you can control your mix so that your dynamic on your main out is within a certain tolerance, that the mastering guy can come in and do what he needs to do to sweeten it up, do some EQ changes, do this, do that, overall feel stuff, dynamic change for the appropriate delivery, he's going to like you a lot more. But on the broadcast side, we've got the same thing. The only difference is we can't rewind and go relook at sections. So we can't draw in automation. We can't predict accurately what's going to happen. We can rehearse as much as we want. Bring a crowd in, bring adrenaline in, bad sandwiches for lunch just before a broadcast and the drummer's not feeling well. He's down 20% in his energy levels. We'll hear that. Vice versa. He goes and has 6 Red Bulls and coffee just before he comes onto stage, and he's like, whoa, what's happening? So you need to build in tolerances all the way from your gain stage right the way through. So if it's a drummer, I'll make sure that, again, mic placement, capturing, that's 90% of your sound of the whole drum kit. Right microphone, properly tuned drums, placed properly, collaboration with the drummer, following his dynamic range, paying attention to how he plays, everything from cross stick to cymbals to all of that, mic it properly, come back to the console, and you can actually do a little bit of creative work instead of panel beating. And if you just throw mics on and go sit behind the console without making sure that all the aspects are right, you end up using half the tools in front of you to fix it rather than create or be creative. So it's important for that. And then once it's in the console, I'll leave a little bit of headroom on the dynamic on the capturing side. So if he does, play a bit louder, especially on the kick and snare. If he does play a bit louder, it doesn't clip out, but I don't want to be too low that if he plays a bit softer, it doesn't work. All these kind of things. And then I do part compartmental, call it mastering. I run a lot of VCAs, as many VCAs as I can. I'm fortunate enough to be working on a Avid S6L. It's got 48 VCAs. So I can run as many VCAs as I need to compartmentalize my mix for control, for that responsive control I was talking about. So I'll have a VCA for the drums, but within that I'll have kick, snare, hats, I'll have toms, I'll have cymbals, I'll have some other percussion stuff, which maybe there's SPDs or percussions and all that on different VCAs. I can get a balance between them and bring them all back into a master drum VCA, which also then goes back into a band VCA. So you can have any channel on the drum kit being affected by at least 3 or 4 VCAs potentially. So you've got to keep your head around it. You need to understand what you're doing, because you can start counteracting some stuff. But I also still use old school subgroups. I use subgroups for routing so that I can do some level control, some loudness control within sections. Because if I do my drum kit and I get my drum sound nicely mastered, then my final stage compression and dynamic control is not responding to momentary peaks and stuff coming from my drum kit, which is affecting everything else in my mix. That's happening within the drum section. And I do that throughout the chain, whether it's guitars, keyboards. Keyboards, you don't have to do so much. Again, I spoke about it the other night. If you have a keyboard player with a bunch of keyboards around him and you've set your gain structures properly, and then he does his mix and you get a level, and if he's dynamically hearing himself the same way that you are, if he makes a little bit louder and softer here and there, that's how he wants it in the mix. So don't fiddle too much with that. Having said that, obviously from a tonal perspective, sometimes depending on the song, he wants to play a certain pad that might get masked a little bit if you don't push it up, vice versa. Or he plays another one where he's just playing with his right hand, on a very high octave, and it comes through quite drastically. So you've got to pull it down slightly because it's coming out a little bit louder than what he is anticipating. But generally, the guys that are producing their own sounds, instead of just using preset patches, you get some really good opportunities to let them do their thing, and it sounds amazing. And again, we come back to the whole band's being produced. There's nothing better than sitting with a band that's been produced and they're disciplined. And they can actually, if you're on a virtual soundcheck and you come back to the band, they're actually doing what they did in the virtual soundcheck again live. They're disciplined, they're skilled. But having said that, the human element is still there. So I am going to get a little bit of tolerances, but I can manage it with my responsive setup. And then going from that, for example, from a music element, one of the most difficult things probably to manage within a loudness environment from a music perspective is you can have one song which is piano and vocal. Piano and a nice middle C, low chord with a full vocal. It sounds amazing and beautiful. And in the house, the front of house engineer can come in and really create that feel. He can come in softer. He can build into the song. He can go with a 15 dB dynamic range from the start to the end of the song to really bring in the punch, and the audience goes along on that ride. Now, how do I do that in a broadcast environment when I've got R128 standards to follow, neg 23? I can't go and start the song at neg 28, neg 30 because it's soft, and then build the song in, because the song starts at home, you sit with the volume, you go, I can't hear the side of the song, you push it up, turn up the volume, and then it gets louder and you got to turn it down again. So as an engineer, I've got to work around workflows and dynamic control within my mix to make that moment. I use EQs a lot. I use reverbs well. But I've got to do some mastering to get that piano fullness up, to get the vocal fullness up to a standard loudness perception without making it sound loud. Not just like I've just turned up the volume, because you can do that as well. You can just turn up the volume and it gets louder. But then and then if I just pull it softer, you're going to hear it. So I've got some EQ stuff that I do. I've got some loudness leveling that I can play with throughout a song. So it's very important to rehearse and figure out what you're going to do and plan it so that you can be preemptive in your adjustments as well. You can't just change it because people can hear that. So, if the song starts with that piano and vocal, and it's nice and full, when the full band is in, your loudness is still the same. But the body needs to get bigger. The vocal is still at the same volume, but it needs to sit the effect of the song. So you can do that very well through managing your effect and managing your compressions. You can use some automation and scenes and that kind of stuff, but I prefer to do that kind of stuff on the fly because I can anticipate and swell out of something into something else better than what a snapshot's going to do, because I've also got to listen to the vocal. I've got to pick my moments to do things. So it is, because I can have a song like that in a broadcast. If we talk about The Voice, for example, piano, vocal, sits the whole song. The next song is, a U2 song, which is full kit straight in off the bat, and the two contestants have got to be at the same volume to the audience. So your ability to bring the feel of the song out without relying on volume, because this is where the difference comes in between mixing front of house and mixing broadcast. Front of house guy, if you want that wow factor, the next song is a rock and roll. You have your faders preset. When the guy drops in, whoa, the audience sits back. That's amazing. And if you want that tender moment, you come in a bit softer, and it gets created by the dynamic. Audience is pulled in. So how do we do that in broadcast? If you think about it, they're doing it in CDs and recordings all the time, and your mastering engineer comes in there and playing with how we perceive volume. You can have a guy that's screaming at you for 20 minutes at a soft volume. You're going to be irritated with him after 2 seconds because the tone is important. Someone can't scream at a gentle tone. That's just the nature of screaming. Certain frequencies, no matter who your voice is, gets emphasized. So being able to translate the tone perception, if I want to bring a vocal up like that and warm a vocal up by adding certain characteristics in the vocals, we all know that if you listen to albums, some modern day R&B or pop stuff where the vocal is really clean, in your face, a lot of sibilance, you can hear a lot of mechanical sounds, all that gets created. For studio recording, you can do that quite nicely. If someone's on a handheld in an auditorium and they're talking and they're doing something like this and they start looking around, all of that changes. So you've got to be very careful on what you boost and what you don't boost. And I've seen guys do this where they have a rehearsal and they get that mic sounding amazing. And then the crowd comes in and there's 40% crowd because they've done so much makeup gain on the dynamic control that it just overpowers the vocalist because they're singing just off the mic because they don't want to be too pronounced, but now it's too loud. So we do a lot of coaching on microphone techniques and ask guys in certain songs. And with time, people that know their voices and know the microphones get used to it. But sometimes you've got to ask artists, in that song, really get into that microphone. We need you to get in there so we can get the fullness because that's what the song requires. And vice versa. If the guys are belting it and the mic's on a stand, he's on a guitar, you got to pull back slightly, because it gets a bit too much tonally. You could break up a capsule, you can popping in it, all that kind of stuff. So it's very important to follow all of this elements. I'm going to just check here if I've got some questions yet. What is Johan saying? Paul Smith, always saying something. Darren Miller, basically mixing into the limiter. Well, I'm not sure if you're asking or saying something, so maybe you want to just explain that. Can my team also do all this without me being there? Yes. I've taken a lot of time to teach guys and train guys, and I'm working on the young guys. I've got, in this last season of The Voice, the 1 week, I got a little bit fluey, if you want to call it. The minute you got ENT kind of thing happening everywhere, your hearing is compromised. I sat through the rehearsals. I got Eddie in. Eddie sat there, and then I got out of my chair. He sat down. And then I let him mix the whole episode. I got a chance to walk around, go check what the guys are doing. I wasn't sniffing or snotting, but I could feel that I was a little bit clogged up. And the first sign of that is I want to make it louder. I'm not happy. I want to turn the volume up slightly. So instead of me doing that, he sat there. The last The Voice season of Nigeria, I didn't even go to studio. Eddie did the whole thing. Some of the other programs we've got with Mandla and the guys, they're running different sessions. And I mean, obviously, something that I've said and I've taught, and I got this from my dad, and I said it the other day, if you're not working yourself out of a job, you're doing something wrong, which means you're not training up the next generation. As valuable as you think you are, no one's replaceable. And you can't move on and grow into other things if you do not teach and train up other guys and mentor other guys to take over from you. Otherwise, you're stuck in a rut. A surgeon can't do anything else but surgery. So if you want to be training people, you've got to step back, let other people in there so that your hands are free to demonstrate and do other things. So Valdo's got a nice question. Would you run automation if you're running time code in broadcast? So I said this the other night. We, fortunate enough, working with Thatch Music and James, we run time code for the productions. LTC coming off of the Ableton session. We send that to the lighting guys. I mean, James and them record that so they can program after hours with the LTC as well. I run LTC in terms of snapshot triggers. In other words, the way the show runs, often the schedule of the show, depending on who gets voted out and voted in on some of these shows, gets changed around. Even on some of the award shows, if someone's not there or a presenter's missing or something's gone wrong with a trophy or this, and they throw segments around. And if you are running timecode, when the MD presses play, your desk recalls the right timecode. You don't have to worry about the song order. That's the one thing. And then what I do is I run snapshots for not so much automation as what you would think about it in a DAW scenario, but automation in the sense of verse chorus elements where maybe the guitar switches between acoustic and electric, or there's two vocalists singing very set sections of the song. I don't want to sit with both mics up. I want to keep it as clean as possible. So moving from one mic to the next, anticipate. I don't just bring the one in. I'll bring the one in a little bit just before they sing, and then that once they start, this one goes out. And instead of me doing that, again, preset volumes, because if I've rehearsed with a vocal at a certain level and there's a nice balance, for me pushing my fade up to that point to try and remember where that balance point was, if I can use automation, I'm going to use automation. So that's an interesting one. When we do the songs where there's lots of vocalists coming in and going out, like very dramatic type stuff, I try and use as much automation as possible for muting and unmuting the right mics at the right time. Obviously, if the whole production is on timecode, it works. If you're touring with a little band, you can actually use timecode very effectively because the band's doing their own songs time after time after time after time. So you can emphasize solos, you can do this, you can do that, but you've got to still have your fingers and be responsive, because if the guitarist misses his overdrive or he's kicked his gain on his one pedal slightly and you just press recall, you're gonna still have to have your fader on the button. So you can, if you run enough snapshots, you can simulate automation to the T. I remember in 2009 when Muse came out and they did the Coke Fest. The engineer came out, ran pink noise to the PA, done back, sat back, started his show, and stood with his hand in his pocket with a cigarette for the entire show. The VT guy was running the VTs for the screens, which was feeding MIDI timecode into the profile at that time because it couldn't run LTC yet, but it could receive MIDI timecode. And the entire show was snapshot. But the band is doing exactly what they've done for the last, I think that was their 55th show in a row, worldwide tour, and they had 3 months in a warehouse prepping the show. So obviously a lot of preparation went into that. But I mean, if on all of our consoles is the button to bypass all timecode and just go manual, and you've got to be able to do that. So it can be a real blessing in disguise at the right times. Another question here. What's one of the biggest challenges when mixing broadcast that's different from front of house? I think I answered that. I don't know when you joined in, Pulling. It's just your ability to transfer dynamic. At front of house, if you want that kick to cut through because you're getting excited, you just make it louder. Hopefully your PA can manage it, but you can really get creative on how you work volume dynamic in a room. If the drums are really going for it and you push the drums, you can create a real nice vibe. But I can't just go louder in broadcast. I've got to maintain a loudness. I've got a little graph here I wanted to show you, which just shows you, it's a good way of explaining our environments. So car, late night, kitchen, living room, home theater, and cinema. In cinema, acoustically controlled, it's quiet in there. People hear popcorn packets and all that. You've got an extremely wide, up to 30 dB range in your dynamic. So you can have a whisper scene and then a bomb explode and the place shakes and you wet your pants. And it all works. But if you, and I think people have seen this, if you rip a Blu-ray, for example, and then try and watch it on your phone, you're changing that volume all the time and you're really struggling to hear because this device cannot translate that dynamic range accurately. So that's why we talk about deliverables. So if we're working living room one, if you see there where we are there, the third one, we're sitting on less, we're sitting at about 18 dB dynamic range instead of 30. And all the way to your car, if you think of your car, road noise, all the noise around you, late night, noise around you, you want to be listening at a lower volume. That late night one, if you're sitting on your phone or a device and you're listening, you're not listening at full volume. You've got little speakers on your device. You want to listen at a comfortable level. So if the loud parts or the explosions are too loud and the whispering is too soft, you get annoyed by turning the level up and down. So the closer your dynamic or your loudness range is, the more consistent your volume experience is, or the perceived volume experience is for the listener. So if we take that back to what we're doing within a music element, one of the ways to make your mix sound louder. So if we take TV ads, they go, some of them go stupid on this dynamic range element. They'll bring it down to 2 or 3 dBs dynamic range. So the whole ad sounds screaming loud. And if you come out from one ad to the next ad, that one really grabs your attention. There's a couple of programs I can think of now that does that well. And if you're competing with those ads and then coming out of one of those ads into your piano song, you know that you've got a 10 dB volume dip from the one section to the other section. So how do you manage that? So obviously we use our crowd, we use a bunch of stuff, but I try and work my mixes. I try and end up with about a 5 dB to 6 dB dynamic range, which is similar to your late night one there, within my music. So in that very narrow bandwidth, you've got to create a little bit of life. Now I'm going to say this outright. If you don't have the band on stage that can deliver technically and sonically, in other words, garbage in, garbage out, if they give you, gold, you can achieve that. If it's not arranged music and not well produced music, and the guys are everybody's just doing their thing and showing off, it's just going to sound a mess. You cannot do that. It's pull your hair out type stuff, because you're going to try and do one thing, but you cannot do that. So you have to back off so you can open up a little bit, and then you miss the boat a little bit. So, we're assuming we've got A-class musos. I can think of a couple of drummers, a couple of bass players. If they're on a gig, they give so much freedom to everybody else because they're so consistent. They're so consistent in their delivery, their dynamic, and consistency. There's nothing better than a consistent drummer. A consistent drummer is not just a good time. You can have a guy that can go with feel, and some guys like certain drummers because of the way they feel, but they are so inconsistent on their kick, on their snare, where they hit on the snare, your sounds up and down. I mean, if you're a recording engineer, you'll understand what I'm saying. Even live guys, you get certain sounds. I for example, there's a couple of drummers where if I hear the kick sounds different, I don't even have to think about it if it's the drummer. I know the mic's moved because it's not him. And then you go check, and yeah, the mic's moved. Someone's kicked the mic, or the inside mic slipped, or something's changed. Because we know the consistency of the source being delivered, and you want to get to that position. If you do, then you can really create a really nice dynamic range that works. So it's important to have that control, and within your I'll read some more questions while I'm talking. So within your workflow, you've got to be able to control all that stuff, and you want to stay in control all the time, but you've got to be able to respond. You need to deliver. At the end of the day, the context of what you're delivering, which is the vocal, what people are watching at home, they might be like a really great, I don't know, little fiddle on a keyboard or something that happens that no one knows about, but the band knows about it. And if you miss it, the band's going to know about it, but the people at home don't know about it. So if you're not ready for that, you're doing a disservice to the band, but no one's going to notice. When I say no one, I'm talking about the audience, and that's still not right. You can get away with a lot from that perspective. But the other perspective is it's a very unforgiving audience. So when people are sitting at home, if there's a bit of a fuzzy picture or something's not rack, or like on some of these DSTV channels where it breaks up because of weather, as long as the audio is there, you're not going to change channel. The minute the audio starts making any kind of racket, you change channels. You can't sit through that sense disruption. So just stay true to that. is it preferable to send the FOH mix directly out of broadcast or to split using a mix separate control room? Well, that's what we're saying. So if you're in a music context, Hans, I think some people tune in way after I started, so I've answered some of these questions, but it's fine. If you're in a different context, if it's a corporate and it's background music and a podium mic, or a guitar and a vocal, you can either send direct outs from front of house or just a nice mix, or what we spoke about the other night. If it's a very simple 3-piece setup, you can do a post-fade aux mix to broadcast and then go listen there, and if the guitar's a bit too soft, you can, on your post-fade, make the guitar a bit softer so that it follows your mix. There's some simple ways of doing that. But you've got to have a way of managing. If it's going to go to post, in other words, if you're sending that to the broadcast guys and they're going to go to post studio somewhere, you don't have to worry about the level, as long as it's a healthy level going to them so they've got something to work with. Otherwise, do your thing. If it's going to air, you have to do loudness management. You have to have some way of getting your R128 standard. If it's a van that you're feeding and they've got something on their side, great. If they don't, unfortunately, a lot of the small flyaway kit type vans, the guys are not prepared for loudness management to that degree. They're working off digital inputs and they've got little faders on screen and all that, and they can even do a plug-in if they have to, but they're not audio guys. So having an audio guy, even if he has to work with you on the front of house mixer, is still better than not having anybody paying attention to that. DeCarlo, I think I just answered that question. What advice would you give guys who are mixing FOH and broadcast at the same time, same desk? It's exactly that. Even if it's a 50-channel mix, take a stereo bus, make it a post-fade auxiliary, send that auxiliary through a mastering chain to your broadcast, have a listen to the broadcast, and if there's subtle differences in your effects and your vocals, you can make adjustments on that post-fade aux, so that if while you're mixing the band for front of house, the mix that you're interacting with is having a similar effect on the post-fade, which has an outcome on your broadcast. So, but again, someone has to be listening to it. You can get to a point where that's pretty settled. If a source changes or something changes, you're going to have to just have a listen. But it's a very good way of working around a problem. If there are some places where if you're in a theater environment and it's acoustically a good room and you're doing a really good mix, it's going to work for broadcast from a mix perspective, but you still have to manage the loudness. So if it is something that we're doing for, it's being pre-recorded for broadcast at a later stage, which means it's going to a post facility, and someone like Tinus gets onto it, they can do a little bit. They can even these days with some of the plugins and isotope and all that, do a bit of a rebalance between percussive and vocal and all that, to manage that slightly, do a mastering, and it can be okay. But if you're in a completely live environment, the whole thing is someone has to listen to it. You cannot get away with doing live if you're not listening to what you're doing. And mixing front of house, hoping that the broadcast is okay, not ideal. Budget, especially a lot of churches do this. They don't have the budget for another engineer and another technical setup, so they do take the front of house. But if you just bring it around to a post-fade mix, if you've got enough mixes left, it can work. Idea of mixing using two mixers, analog and digital. Is it possible for one for live and the other for broadcast? Well, the difference between two mix locations, your biggest challenge there is just getting the signal to both sides. This is a question from Sylvester. So these days with MADI, if everything's digital, just take MADI feeds everywhere. It'll work. You'll get the source everywhere, but gain control is obviously with one of the players in the room. The most critical position being broadcast in this scenario. So if it is a broadcast show, I would say give gain control to the broadcast guy. If the broadcast is purely tracking for mixing later, as long as there's no problems in the front, where if it's front of house or monitoring doing gain control, they understand what they're in, you can get away with a lot. If it's different types of mixes or even analog and digital, like you say in your example, an analog split comes into play, some XTAs or clock techniques or something, split the signal and everybody does their own thing. On the voice, we actually ran XTA splits. We ran 112 channels of XTA splits. between broadcast and what was happening in the building, primarily because of the workflow of the production/venue. Simon will be the first one to bring this to light. We were running in a venue that had church on a Sunday morning at Mosaic, and we had rehearsals at 2 o'clock. So the church would run till 12:30, and then we had an hour to change the entire stage over. The church was using our tech. In other words, they were using our sound system, our lighting, everything like that on presets, and then we had to switch over to our scenario. So we had very limited time, but what would happen is on a Sunday morning, I would come in at 8 o'clock and I'd start running virtual sound checks, which means I'm sitting in the OB van, I'm mixing the stuff we did yesterday, going over and over and over, and whenever the inside is ready, I just switch back to stage racks and I'm ready. I wouldn't be able to do this if I was sharing inputs with them because of clocking and all these other kind of things. Clocking is another discussion. I think we'll talk a lot about that on Wednesday when we get into the technical. But as well as during the week, sometimes every now and again what would happen is they start getting into a dance rehearsal or something, and James and them wanted a bounce of a certain mix. I could switch back to a virtual sound check, do what I need to do, switch back to the live stuff without affecting what's happening in the room. And if we were sharing head amps, if I switch to a virtual sound check, I can be, again, clocking issues and taking sources away from everybody. So based on that workflow, we chose to go in this direction to have autonomy over the audio signal coming off of the stage so that I can do what I need to do, they need to do what they need to do. I was also clocking primarily to the broadcast. Our system was so big and complicated with optical running and sound grid running and Alisa system running in the venue and all these kind of things that we clocked, and we were running Dante. So I was running Dante on my side with a closed loop. They were running Dante on their side with a closed loop and talkback. It was just so many different overlay perspectives that if we had to try and lock everybody together, everybody had to be on the same page all the time. In other words, context-wise. So if I decided to switch on halfway through a session because they were doing dance rehearsals, I wasn't needed because there's no band there. The band's coming at 2 o'clock. I come in and I switch on. I can literally disrupt the entire system by just having Dante goes because its clocking's losing here and primary's going there and all these kinds of things can happen. So we made a decision, long discussions with Adrian and the guys, of how we were going to run it so we can smoothly switch between different scenarios in that production. When we were at the same production at Sasani Studios, for example, we all fed off MADI streams because we're in this lockdown studio environment. My virtual soundcheck was running off of an alternative MADI stream on my side, which I can just switch. Had no impact what was happening in the room because I'm just doing input switch source on my side. Dante was just running on my side, XYZ. So it's all depending on the context that you're within. So just keep that in mind. It's a long way of answering that question. What other questions have we got here? Is mixing broadcast more or less the same on all consoles, excluding consoles made specifically for broadcast? So when you speak about a console that's made specifically for broadcast, or what would be known as a broadcast console, which is a Lawu or a Calrac, Waldemar just got the Calrac agency, or Studer, or API, or you've got a whole bunch of them. The big thing about those consoles is they've got GPIs and they've got different networking solutions to integrate them into the broadcasting environment from an engineering perspective, which means the engine's sitting in engineering, the IOs on the back of the tail, the routing of all the audio interfaces and the MADI stuff can be brought up on centralized computers and everybody can get access to them. You often find some of these vans where they set up the guy that's mixing the audio isn't doing the patching or isn't in charge of comms or isn't in charge of XYZ. It's the engineers doing it and vice versa. In some vans, that guy's also doing the comms. So all those MADI inputs, they can take in a tremendous amount of voices in terms of I/O connections on these consoles, even though you're just using, 20 odd on a broadcast. But your interaction with everybody and being able to send mix minuses in a plethora of directions, having pre-fade listens on everything to director, and then your director's in the console because you're doing all your comms routing through the console. That's a broadcast console in that context. From a mix perspective, if I'm doing just a music mix, which is what I often do most of the time, we park next to the van and we feed our music feed into the van, and it becomes a stem on the broadcast mixer. So the broadcast guy is sitting there with his VT playbacks, he's got his MCs, he's got music, which is then our feed, and he's got effects. And the effects question is something else we'll talk about, because the way you run effects when the music's playing and not playing is also two different communications. I would actually set myself up to be monitoring when the broadcast is happening, the output of the broadcast console, not my console. That means I get his left-right out, which he's sending to air, coming to me. It comes into my monitoring control. I set it and I listen to that, which means I'm hearing transitions, I'm hearing everything. When I push my fader up, I'm hearing my music, but it's via his thing, which means I can maintain my dynamic control, imaging, level perception, all that kind of stuff. But we can give feedback to each other. So it's a different way of doing your monitoring. My monitoring becomes quite a complicated matrix to set up, but it works in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. So mixing broadcast, there are some elements that any mixer needs to be able to manage, and one of them is obviously these days with the expectation of a broadcast facility. If you can't do signal routing / soft patching in a host of directions, you're going to get stuck. If you can't do a couple of mix minuses, you're going to get stuck. Mix minuses is pretty much just if someone had to talk in, or you would send a mix to someone and they're coming feeding back at you. You don't want to send themselves back to themselves or yourself back to you to have feedback loops and all that kind of stuff. It's a quick layman explanation. And being able to route comms in and through your system, because your radio comms and your wired comms need to hear director needs to hear this. Your production assistant wants to hear click track, and what the music guys are hearing, and all these different workflows that you need to be able to manage. So having a console that's capable of doing a lot of auxiliary / matrix workings helps a lot. If I had to put down an M7 to do a broadcast mix, and don't get me wrong, Supersport ran M7s in their Supersport studios for a long time, but they were maxed out, and they were running very specifically orientated workflows within the Supersport studio. So Supersport studios is 6 lapel mics, a couple of IEMs, EVSs coming back from everywhere, and controlling feeds coming in from stadiums and all that. So very predictable, but that's just for that one studio. If we had to take that out into the field, into an OB-van scenario, the M7 is out of its depth immediately because of the connection scenario. You can't, if you put a MADI card in, you're going to do 16 channels per MADI port, if it's Dante or MADI, because of the MY16 protocol. These days with CLs, a lot better. They've improved now up to 64, but you're also still limited to how many slots you have. So if you've got stage rack, you're running that off by a Dante. If I want to put MADI in and out, I've got to have slot cards. It's only got 1 or 2 slot cards, and now I'm stuck again. My EVS is running off MADIs. My comm system is running off MADI. We were sitting for the voice, we were sitting in the Supersport van where he only had 1 auxiliary MADI card. So because we were running multiple, we had red carpet running, we had the stage running, so he was running some stage racks out to get backup feeds and all that kind of stuff off the room. We were running the effects mic straight to him to save channels on my side. So I took that 1 MADI feed that he had, brought it into my DOT unit, took the feeds I wanted to send to him and back, and gave the rest back to him so that Ross could run Waves plugins on the console. So his Wave plugins couldn't run if I wasn't booted up because of the MADI scenario. So we were multitasking. The DOT M1K2 system is a 16-way MADI matrix unit that's a beast. And you almost can't do something these days without something like that can just take anything into any direction. I've got it's 64 times 16 times 2. It's the amount of I/O port routing that I can do per individual channels, and even then clock the port routing that's going through there can be at different clock rates than what some of the others are doing without using SRCs. SRC is a sample rate converter, which is another kettle of fish. So it gets very complicated, but you just got to keep your head above the water and planning. None of this happens. I mean, we were setting up, I showed when me and Adrian was talking the other night, we were doing we planned more than a year in advance. We set up the channel list for the live broadcast, and then workflows and months and months and months of workflows in diagrams and talking to OB-Vans, what they can do, what they can't do, planning this, planning that. So once we got on site, we executed what we planned. And then we had very little adaptation to do, adding a little bit here, adding a little bit there as we're going along. But we're not trying to create something out of nothing. We had a massive infrastructure already pre-plotted and pre-planned. With broadcast being a marriage between live and studio, how much of your approach is based on purely on reinforcing what's happening on stage versus using gear and color or mix? That's from Valdu. So again, what we said is, if you're doing a broadcast mix and your band is amazing, you're working with the band, and we spoke about this the other night. You guys are welcome to go look at some of our other episodes. Communication, relationship with the guys, representing what they're doing to the best of your ability, and adding your technical skill and creativity to make it sound right and to make it work. Obviously, the more managing you're doing, especially of loudness and loudness range and dynamic control, your ability to manage tone and all that kind of stuff becomes even more creative. The way that you're using dynamic tools on drums and stuff to get attack through and all that kind of stuff gets more and more tested. Your technical skills get tested in terms of your delivery application. You get away with a lot more. If you've got a little bit of variant settings on dynamics, for example, even just on your attack time on toms on the PA, it's not as obvious as what it is in a broadcast environment. I'm not dissing anybody. I've experienced it. You get away with a lot. It's a very transparent image of what you're doing. So versus, coloring your mix, I think that's you just saying being creative. You need to be. At the end of the day, I said it the other day. When people like, or there's some good engineers out there, same as good mastering guys, it just means that they're doing stuff that other people like more. If you've got the ability to do something which more people like than other people, you get into a situation where you get asked to do more work. If people don't like what you're doing, you're wasting your time. If it was purely technical, you'd get away with a lot, and they wouldn't need us. If it was just a technical one in, one out all the way through and make sure the technical path is set, it would be easy. Do you think having a dedicated channel of outputs on a mixer for broadcast must be almost your pick from the FO channels that you pick everything? So I think he's asking, should all channels go in all directions? Ideally, if you do have a situation where your channel count is a little bit constrained, there are ways and means where you can do some submixing. For example, if there's 6 keyboard players on stage and the front of house has already got them into a couple of groups, rather get 2 stereo groups from front of house for the keyboards, and assuming again that the keyboard players are managing their own levels. So instead of having 12 channels, you can have 4 channels, and so forth and so forth. On dynamic elements like drums and all that, if there's an in kick, out kick, and a sub kick on a drum kit, I'm not going to use the sub kick on a broadcast mix because there are people with subs at home, but if they're running them in a Pro Logic mode or in a different mode, or 1% of the people are going to get the effect of what you're trying to do. Your in and out kick tuned properly can give you way more of a contextual response to what you want to do than trying to get a sub gig which has got a very specific use into a scenario where no one's going to hear it. I'm not saying a sub gig's not going to work, but we've got to be realistic. People go and buy a Samsung 5.1 system and stick them all under the TV because it looks nice. And they don't know what the different setting is, and they just go switch on stuff till it sounds good. Meanwhile, it's just they're adding, virtual surrounds and all these kind of stuff to their settings. So I hope that answers that question. Once I got advice from a sound received from the line out of a camera is better than the one received from the desk. Well, I think sound from a camera, off the camera mic, and sound off the desk If your desk sound is way too low or distorted in, the camera sound can sound good if the guy's in front of one of the PA stacks and it's a decent Sennheiser or something camera. But if what you're sending from the desk is being managed and listened to, I've said this a couple of times now. I've seen camera guys, and if you're a camera guy, I'm sorry, but just looking, I've got level. You don't even have headphones on. You've got level, but you can't hear if there's a hum. You don't hear if it's distorted, if there's a noise factor or anything like that. You have to listen to sound. That's what sound is there for, to be listened to. I'm not going to send a TV program out with the level meter on screen and everybody at home must just be happy because they can see it. You can see there's volume. No, we got to listen to it. It's the same thing with monitors. If you're doing monitors for a band on stage, you don't adjust anything for anyone on stage if you're not hearing what he's hearing. So if the bassist asks for something, your first way, and a lot of the consoles these days, by changing your workflow on the console. In other words, if the bassist is asking for something, by selecting the bassist bus, the monitoring audio cue bus follows you. So you're automatically listening to him. But I've seen so many guys that don't know about that feature, or on other desks where that doesn't happen, and they'll make adjustments on stuff and they're not listening because they're trying to do multiple stuff. But and then you wonder why people aren't happy. And then when you eventually listen to it, you go, "Ooh, what was I thinking?" Well, that's what I want to know. What were you thinking? We have to listen. That's why I was saying, about loudness. This one here, loudness leveling encourages mixing only by ear after setting levels and fixed monitor output. So we spoke about that right in the beginning. If your monitoring scenario is set up right and you're in the right context, you will by nature over time develop muscle memory in your ears, and you'll hit neg 23 without a loudness meter up because you're trained for it. And I've done this. Not on purpose, but I do something and then I go, "Oh, where's my loudness? Oh, I'm fine. Carry on." But it's after hours of rehearsing, because you get used to the fixed monitor level. Is even something that if you speak to studio guys and all that, by fiddling with your monitor level, it's like sticking something in your eye and wondering why it hurts. It's stupid. Get into context, understand what you're there to do, fix your eyes on the purpose of what you're there to do, and do that properly. I just noticed that we've gone over an hour already. We've had some really good questions. I hope you guys have gotten something out of this. I think I've covered most of the questions. I'm just going back quickly. I think I just answered that. Puleng's question. He's just asking, do you take into consideration different sound systems in people's houses? Yes, we do. We look at it depending on the platform we're broadcasting on. In other words, broadcaster, their viewers of this program, is it terrestrial? In other words, still antennas on TV, mono speaker, is it flat screens? Depending on who we're broadcasting to. If it's someone that's really into music programs, obviously most TVs even these days do have really good dynamic and frequency response in terms of range. So you get some really good outcomes. But you've got to think about that. What we've done in the past is, if you're sending a mono signal to a terrestrial because it's antenna based stuff, you've got to think of your summing. So you've got to monitor your mono. You've got to think about, we said earlier that with loudness you've got some tolerances, and with some sources, special cases, they anticipate a little bit of a bigger one. But you can't just go louder, because if you think about the system and the chain down the road, an analog broadcast system can only take so much before it distorts. So you need to think about who you're broadcasting to and what they're listening on. And it is a very diverse scenario. Like I said, everybody from cell phones these days to earpieces to TVs, box TVs, loud lounges, quiet lounges, sports bars, restaurants, wherever. There's so many different platforms. So if you manage your loudness for the specific deliverable correctly, you're going to have an acceptable result within that genre. But that's where your skill comes in, and you've got to be, like I said earlier, your responsive capabilities to make sure that you stay within that is important. And enjoy it. I mean, it's got to sound good still. You've got to put your effort into it. You've got to put your mind to it and get it to sound like something that works. There are technical elements which can affect the delivery of sound to public, that if you're not aware of it and you're not working with the team, you shoot yourself in the foot. So if you're of the opinion that you're mixing sound and, as long as my mix sounds good, yeah, it's going to work, you're wrong, because you're the only one listening there. You got to think about, when it leaves me, it's going to go there. When it goes from there, it goes there. When it goes there, it goes there. When it goes there, it goes there, there. And after 5, 6, 7, 8 steps, it gets to the consumer. So you need to be aware of what those 8 steps are. And, uplinks, downlinks, fiber links, ICR, MCR. I get very involved with the lineup process when I do broadcasts. It should be something done in the van. And if they're doing it in the van, I get up and I go to the van and I check what they're doing. We check at the receiving. We're speaking to the ICR guys, making sure they got it. Check with the uplink guys. We check left, right. We check our mono sum. We check everything to make sure that what's getting to the end of the chain is as comprehensive as. And once that's at ICR, then we go and we check with MCR. So they're still in the same building. Is the signal that the ICR is getting to MCR? Because remember, there's still soft patching happening in there. And there can be sometimes you're coming from. They did a sports event yesterday on that chain that they're using now, and there was a problem with the audio off the right. So the guy double patched left to get from ICR to MCR. And then you come in, MCR goes, yes, I got left, right. But until you do a quality check and you do a continuity check, you drop left, you drop right, and make sure that it left and right's in the right order, you're not going to know if that's happened. And the guy's not going to know that's happened until he listens. And I've sent out mixes where I get home and I go, why can I only hear one guitar? Where's my other BVs? What's happened? And it's literally that's happened. There's been 2 lefts or 2 rights that have gone to air. Or there's been a phasing issue somewhere, and you get there and there's no low end, and the reverb is like there, and the vocal is like nowhere. And you think, what's going on here? And there's been a phasing issue somewhere in the chain. And you can't point fingers at people if you're not involved in the whole process. Pre-packaged material gets quality controlled, goes through vetting systems, gets ingested and gets tested. But if you're live, you've got to be involved in the whole process. You've got to understand what's happening to your signal and managing that signal. And trust other people to work with you. And take the time to understand how the loudness works and how that gets affected all the way down. If there are ALCs, automatic loudness control units, in the chain, which some broadcasters do, and you don't have a choice, you need to know what those settings are. That's why I say I go and look at off-air stuff, look at what they are, and I have to compensate on my side for that. It's not going to be generous to me just because I'm live. Where is some more questions? Collaboration and lineups. Yeah, Tinas, I just said that. So Tinas is going to be with us on Wednesday. So he's watching now. So Tinas, prepare yourself. We're going to do a lot of technical chatter on Wednesday to explain what I've just said in a little, very short period of time. And Ayo is watching us from Nigeria. How's it, Ayo? What plugin or processor do you use on your final output stage to manage your loudness and give you the sweet, crispy sound of the voice? So what I do is I've got I've already said it, I do compartmentalized loudness control with dynamic management, especially on subgroups. Like my drum kit, I'll bring my low end up, high end up, so that I can mix into that limiter over there instead of on my final limiter. And then by the time I get to my last one, I tend to use like an SSL bus compressor just to smooth everything out. And then I do like an L3 or something loudness meter just to try and, especially your true peaks have to be controlled. You've got to put a true peak limiter in, make sure that you maintain that. And then my loudness meter where I can watch it, because I'm watching my momentaries, I'm watching my short terms, I'm watching my integrated. Because your momentaries and stuff like that, if like we were saying, if you ignore your momentaries, you think you're fine, but somewhere there's something clipping the whole time. And digital distortion is not pretty. And you can get your production in trouble if you're not doing your part and watching your true peaks, making sure your momentaries and your integrated is right. You're going to feel it, but your producers are feeling it first from the commissioning editors. You've got to get your technical stuff sorted out. And then have we done 5.1? We've been wanting to do it. There's been obviously 5.1 is something that's happening all the time in movies and all that kind of stuff, and you get the different options on your TV. from a live broadcast perspective, we've spoken about doing it, but it's not been done yet. In South Africa, it has been done. I've set up for it. I was prepared for it in this past season. We tested it, but we didn't broadcast it. So we tested it so we could test it in-house. I actually went to listening sessions at the client, and we listened to, and we could hear the result of the benefit of it. But again, the previous question was, do you consider your people at home? How many people at home have got a tuned 5.1 setup? So we're getting there. We're ready for it. But it's not just me. If I just do a 5.1, there we go. Oh yeah. Tina says I didn't. My loudness control is not a plugin. Loudness control is my chain of plugins. So Tina's just commented, yeah, there's no plugin to control your loudness. You have to mix to spec. So I use my bus compression, my true peak limiters, and my dynamic range controllers throughout my chain, and then I still mix. So my faders on my VCAs, I'm watching my short term especially to know where I am in the song, and that's where I can control those soft starts and then slip back into a dynamic chorus or something like that, and I'm changing and I'm mixing with what I'm seeing on my meters. And I said earlier, you're listening, but you have to watch what you're doing. And then if you run, we actually ran a Junger just in insert mode, not an insert mode, in a feed mode, so we could see it was drawing a loudness graph for us, so we could get an idea of what our songs were doing across like a 2-3 minute period, which really helped me a lot. I could identify parts in songs where I could probably get a bit more aggressive or get less aggressive, or watch out for this or watch out for that. But yeah, there's a plug-in control is an automatic level control, and I think we'll talk about this heavy on Wednesday, because that, I have my opinions on those things, and Tinas is probably laughing at me now, but we'll leave it at that. We'll talk about those on Wednesday. I think that we've had a good session tonight. I've answered, I think, all the questions. Thanks, Ayo, all the way from Nigeria. Hope you're doing well over there. Here's one. What options are there for remotely controlling a post-fade mix meant for broadcast? Is over front of house control. Oh, well, that's an easy one. If you work, I know, Jose, you work on VIs quite a bit. You can use the app. If you get a good Wi-Fi system set up, and you get your HiQ net set up, you can go sit in a room with an iPad and control a post-fade mix. Not ideal. Make sure you got continuity, but the key thing is to be able to listen to it. So all your front of house guy has to do is send you a direct out of that auxiliary output to you, so that you can listen to it. If it's going to go to a van, you go sit in the van with the iPad, you have a listen, and you control it. These days, with almost all consoles, there's some kind of iPad app or some remote control software. It's a very good idea. And it just endorses what I said earlier. You have to be listening to it. Someone has to listen to what's happening. Okay. Thanks, guys. That was a good chat. Thanks for the questions coming through. Like our page. You'll see when we do our next session. Our next one is... I'm just looking at my messages here. So Wednesday night we're doing Tina Smith, and then on Thursday night I'm going to be talking, just to have a bit of a conversation, sit down with Marius Marais, a friend of mine. Most of you know Marius as well. That'll be a nice chat, just talking about the industry and our own experiences a little bit. We've had the privilege of working together for I don't know, 24, 25 years. And then Thursday morning, just watch the Soundcraft webpage. I'm doing a thing with Gabriel on there. That'll be exciting. Is that Thursday? No, it's Wednesday morning. Sorry, my bad. Wednesday morning. And then, so Wednesday morning, I'm doing the thing on Soundcraft. Wednesday night with Tina Smith, broadcasting technical. And then on Thursday with Marius Marais. And I'll fill you in from there. 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning is the Soundcraft one. Sorry, my MCR is just giving me a lot of information here. My Master Control Committee. And I'll chat to you guys on Wednesday. Enjoy the week. Thank you guys for tuning in. Like our page. See you soon.